On the night of March 14, 1849, the courthouse of Lowndes County, Alabama, was reduced to blackened rubble. The official account claimed that an oil lamp had overturned in the basement, the sort of accident that happened too often in buildings packed with parchment and dust. But when the smoke cleared and investigators sifted through the remains, they uncovered something that made the explanation feel like a lie. 3 skeletons, still bound in chains, fused to the iron rings bolted deep into the foundation stone. All the county records from 1847 through 1849 were lost in the blaze. Land deeds, probate files, marriage certificates, and most significantly the documents of the Sutton estate. What survived was rumor. Whispers that passed through generations about the Bell River Plantation, about the 2 daughters of Colonel Nathaniel Sutton, and about the slave called Marcus, who disappeared after leaving behind evidence of everything. What follows has been pieced together from fragments, letters recovered from Mobile, medical reports, and testimony hidden away by a Northern abolitionist society until the 1960s. It is a story of inheritance and control, of love twisted into experiment, and of the lies a whole community buried to protect itself. But before the fire, before the courthouse crumbled, the story began 2 years earlier, with a funeral and 2 women who had learned that power was the only form of safety left to them. In 1847, Lowndes County sat in the lush heart of Alabama's cotton belt. The soil there was dark and rich, as if stained by the sweat and blood it consumed. The town of Hanville, little more than a cluster of brick buildings and dirt lanes, served as the county seat. White planters gathered there to talk business and politics, while their wives pretended not to hear the reality beneath the commerce, the trade of human lives. 8 miles south lay Bell River Plantation, accessible only by a private road that twisted through groves of water oak and over 2 tributaries of the Alabama River. The main house stood at the road's end, built in 1828 by Colonel Nathaniel Sutton, a 3-story columned structure with a detached kitchen and 24 slave cabins arranged in neat military rows a quarter-mile behind. The distance was intentional, close enough for command, far enough to silence the cries of the enslaved. The colonel had become wealthy through cotton, but it was not cotton that made him infamous. He had fought under Andrew Jackson during the Creek War and returned from that campaign obsessed with the notion that people could be bred into perfection, just as one bred horses or cattle. His library held medical manuals from Philadelphia, journals on agriculture from Virginia, and letters from university men who shared his conviction that race determined destiny. He catalogued everything: height, complexion, bone structure, temperament. He charted bloodlines like a breeder tracing the lineage of prized livestock. Neighbors called him eccentric. His slaves used a different word, though they never dared to speak it where white ears could hear. The colonel never took a wife. Instead, he bought a woman. Her name was Ruth, described in the bill of sale from Charleston as of light complexion and genteel manner. In 1825, she bore him twin daughters, Sarah and Catherine. He raised them inside the main house, educated them with tutors from Mobile, dressed them in silk and lace imported from New Orleans, but he never freed them. In every legal document they remained his property, bound to him by law and by blood. The twins grew up in a gilded isolation. They read poetry and philosophy, practiced piano and French, painted landscapes of the river that flowed just beyond the cotton fields. But they rarely left the plantation. Their father dictated their visitors their lessons, their very thoughts. He told them they were exceptional, that the world beyond Bell River would never understand them, that safety existed only in obedience. And the girls learned that lesson too well. They became inseparable, 2 minds in perfect symmetry, speaking in half sentences the other could finish, communicating through glances and gestures as if they shared one private language. Sarah favored deep green. Catherine preferred midnight blue. They read books from opposite ends and met in the middle. They shared secrets, brushes, jewelry, and in time, something darker than all of it. When their mother Ruth died in 1839, officially from pneumonia, the enslaved whispered that her body bore bruises that told another story. After her death, the colonel's control grew absolute. Locks appeared on their bedroom doors, locks that could be turned only from the outside. They were made to keep journals detailing their behavior, their dreams, their thoughts. The colonel tested them constantly. He left valuables unattended to tempt them, staged encounters with men to study their reactions, and recorded his observations in the same clinical hand he used for his experiments. By 1847, Bell River had become one of the most prosperous plantations in the region. The colonel owned 63 enslaved people and produced over 100 bales of cotton each year. But among those enslaved, the ratios were strange. Too many children for the birth rate. Too many light-skinned faces. Too many families torn apart just as their children reached adolescence. The overseer, Jonas Pritchett, had served the colonel for 15 years. He kept a separate set of ledgers filled with grim precision. Entries that described punishments, pairings, and births like agricultural notes. His reports listed which women were assigned to which men, which pregnancies were terminated, and by what means. Sarah and Catherine knew more than their father suspected. They read his journals when he traveled to Mobile. They listened through doors. They pieced together enough to understand that the people in the cabins behind their home were not just laborers. They were the subjects of their father's lifelong experiment, his belief that he could manipulate humanity itself, and they learned to hate him for it, slowly, coldly, patiently. The morning of February 3rd, 1847 dawned unseasonably warm, the air heavy with a premonition of storm. The colonel had spent the night writing in his study, lamp burning low beside a plate of untouched food. When he failed to appear at breakfast, no one thought it odd. He often worked through the night. At 10 o'clock, Pritchett entered the study and found the colonel slumped in his chair, head tilted, skin pale as wax. His hand still rested on the desk beside a cup of cold coffee, its surface glinting with a fine sediment that shimmered faintly in the lamplight. Dr. Amos Grayfield rode out from Hanville and pronounced death by natural causes, heart failure, exhaustion. Man burned himself out, he muttered. Happens to the best of us. But the unfinished letter on the desk told a different story. The last line trailed off mid-sentence. I have made certain arrangements concerning my daughters, which must be executed precisely, for their own protection and the preservation of my life's work. Should any person attempt to... And then nothing. Outside the study, the twins stood together in black mourning gowns. Their faces were expressionless, their hands clasped tightly. They did not cry. They did not speak. 3 days later, the funeral took place under a low sky that threatened rain, but held off out of respect for death. Neighbors gathered in the parlor, offering polite condolences and cautious glances toward the twins. None of the enslaved attended the ceremony. Their own service took place in the quarters that night. Voices rising in hymns of deliverance, the kind of songs that sounded like rebellion when carried across the dark fields. The next evening, Jeremiah Osgood, the colonel's attorney from Mobile, arrived with the will. He was a heavy man with silver hair and the uneasy demeanor of one accustomed to delivering unpleasant truths. The reading took place in the colonel's study, now scrubbed clean of its secrets. Sarah and Catherine sat side by side, composed and still. Pritchett hovered near the door, expression unreadable. Osgood untied the black ribbon binding the document and began to read. The colonel left Bell River Plantation to his twin daughters in equal share: house, land, livestock, and human property. But the inheritance came with 3 strict conditions. Both women must marry men of proper social standing within 24 months. Both must bear legitimate offspring within that time. And both must maintain the plantation's output at its current level. Failure to meet any of these conditions would result in the plantation's sale, with proceeds distributed among institutions dedicated to the advancement of agricultural and biological understanding. It was, in essence, a demand that his daughters perpetuate his experiment through marriage. Then came the private letter, sealed in wax, addressed to Sarah and Catherine alone. Osgood handed it to them and looked away as they opened it. The handwriting was their father's, precise, looping, familiar. He accused them of unnatural attachment to one another, of refusing to embrace womanly duties. He wrote that they were products of his design, and that their nature, half of one world, half of another, made them unfit for freedom. "You are what I created," the letter warned. "The blood that runs through you is both your privilege and your prison." When they finished reading, Sarah folded the pages neatly and placed them back in the envelope. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm as marble. "We understand the terms." The room was silent. As Osgood left that evening, the sisters lingered in the study long after the lamps burned low. Sarah traced her fingers along the spines of their father's journals, each one a record of cruelty disguised as science. "He thought people could be bred like horses," she murmured. "He believed blood could dictate destiny. We'll prove him right, but not the way he intended." Catherine looked up sharply, confusion and fear flickering across her face. Sarah opened one of the leather volumes and turned to a page marked by a red ribbon. "Every pairing, every birth, every name. The key to his empire is here." And in that moment the plan began. Quiet, methodical, inevitable. A plan to fulfill their father's will on paper while destroying everything he ever believed in. For weeks after the colonel's burial, Bell River moved like a body learning to breathe again. The air in the main house smelled of lamp oil and old paper, and the silence that had once belonged to their father now belonged to the twins. They ate together at his long mahogany table, managed the accounts with precision, and signed letters in his name so that no merchant or banker would sense the shift in power. To the county, the Sutton daughters appeared dutiful heirs, mourning and industrious. In truth, they were studying. The ledgers, the journals, the breeding records, all became scripture for their rebellion. Page by page, Sarah and Catherine dissected the world their father had built. They learned how he had paired men and women like livestock, how he had measured skulls and charted births, how he had written of refined blood with the fervor of a preacher describing salvation. What they found among the figures and margins wasn't science. It was theology written in the language of possession. From that horror, they drew their design. The will required marriage and childbirth. It did not define the meaning of either. They would satisfy the law while breaking its spirit. To do so, they needed a man clever enough to read instructions, yet powerless enough to obey them. A man whose very existence mocked the system their father worshipped. In April 1847, opportunity arrived in the heat and dust of Hanville's slave market. Every spring, planters gathered in the courthouse square to buy and sell human beings, their voices rising over the crack of whips and the cries of the separated. Sarah and Catherine attended under the pretense of expanding Bell River's labor force, their faces veiled in black mourning lace. Pritchett, the overseer, walked behind them with the air of a man accustomed to obeying power no matter who wore it. Lot after lot passed across the platform. Men, women, and children bartered like bolts of cloth. Then the auctioneer called for attention to one male, property of the late Granville estate. The man who stepped forward stood straighter than most, his gaze level, his skin the color of sand darkened by rain. His name was Marcus. The auctioneer praised his literacy and refined manner, qualities that made the crowd uneasy. Educated slaves were trouble. They read, they remembered, they ran. Sarah watched him scan the buyers, calm and assessing, not with fear, but with calculation. It was the look of someone who understood that every gaze upon him was an appraisal, and yet refused to lower his eyes. She leaned toward Pritchett. "Buy him," she whispered. He hesitated. Educated slaves cost more than they earned. But she repeated the command, and her tone left no room for negotiation. The bidding rose to $1,600 before the crowd lost interest. Pritchett signed the papers, and 3 days later Marcus walked the 8 miles to Bell River, carrying a cloth bag with his only possessions. He expected the usual. Assignment to field or stable, a whip's greeting, a number in a ledger. Instead, he was led directly into the main house and into the study that still smelled faintly of his late master's tobacco. Two women waited there, dressed in mourning black. They looked almost identical, same eyes, same pale skin, same composure. But Marcus noticed the difference in their stillness. The one standing by the window, Sarah, radiated purpose. The other, Catherine, studied him with wary fascination. "You can read and write," Sarah began. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice controlled. "You taught the Granville children." "I did." Catherine tilted her head slightly. The Granvilles were Quakers. They believed in education for all souls. He gave a small nod. They did. What neither sister knew was that the Granvilles had also belonged to a network of abolitionists, gathering evidence from the enslaved. Marcus had spent 5 years documenting atrocities in coded shorthand, hiding his notes inside a hollow Bible. When fever killed the Granvilles, their relatives sold the estate, and Marcus was separated from his records. But he'd kept fragments of memory sharper than paper. Bell River, he would soon learn, was the most dangerous memory yet. Sarah studied him for a long time. "We have an unusual situation here," she said at last. "Our father left conditions on our inheritance. We intend to meet them, on our own terms." Over the next weeks, Marcus learned what that meant. The twins assigned him to the main house as secretary. He balanced accounts, copied correspondence, catalogued the library, and in the evenings discussed philosophy or scripture at Sarah's request. But beneath those tasks ran a current of secrecy. They were testing him. How he spoke, what he read, whether he shared information with the quarters. Every answer became part of a calculation. He passed their tests without knowing their purpose, moving carefully, saying little, listening always. In time, he discovered that silence could be power. It made the sisters talk more freely around him. By mid-May, Sarah revealed the plan. The will demanded marriage and children within 24 months, or the plantation would be seized. They would satisfy the letter of that law while defying its soul. They would marry men approved by the executors, old, sick, or desperate, but the heirs would come from elsewhere. Marcus understood before they said the words aloud. "You mean," he murmured, "me?" Neither denied it. Sarah's gaze was steady. Catherine's fluttered once and stilled. He felt a coldness creep through him. "You're asking for something that could hang all of us." Sarah's voice was calm, "which is why it must succeed. You will be treated well, fed, clothed, protected. When our conditions are fulfilled, you will be freed, with enough money to disappear. Freedom." The word struck like sunlight through fog, but the promise was wrapped in iron. Refusal meant sale to Mississippi fields, where educated men were beaten until the learning left them. Acceptance meant complicity in a deception that could destroy them all. He weighed the options that night while watching moonlight crawl across the ceiling of his quarters. Somewhere beyond that sky lay Philadelphia, where abolitionists gathered stories like his and turned them into weapons. If he survived this, perhaps he could carry proof, names, dates, evidence of Bell River's breeding program. The thought hardened into resolve. The next morning he told Sarah, "I'll do it, on one condition. I want to see everything your father wrote, every journal, every letter, every record." Catherine bristled, but Sarah agreed. "You study here, under our supervision. Nothing leaves this room." Thus began a strange alliance. 2 women bred for dominance and 1 man bred for obedience, bound together by necessity and distrust. Summer settled over Alabama like a fever. The air thickened with insects and the scent of cotton bloom. Behind the shuttered windows of the main house, Sarah and Catherine conducted their search for husbands. They read Osgood's list of eligible men like merchants inspecting livestock, age, debt, reputation, health. They needed suitors who appeared Respectable to the executors, but weak enough to control. Their first prospect was Edmund Varley, a widower of 68 whose failing plantation stood near bankruptcy. When he visited Bell River, he smiled through yellowed teeth and called Catherine a blessing sent to restore his fortunes. After he left, she scrubbed her hands until the skin bled. "He'll do," Sarah said coolly. "He needs us more than we need him." While marriage negotiations crept forward, Marcus read the colonel's journals late into the night. The pages chronicled 20 years of systematic violation disguised as science. Each entry began with a number instead of a name. Female 4 paired with male 2. Result: 1 male child sold 1837. The words turned people into specimens. Yet among the entries, Marcus found signs of resistance. Tools broken accidentally, herbs used to prevent conception, secret literacy spreading through the quarters, and one recurring name written always with irritation: Ruth, the twins' mother. A woman who had resisted in quiet, deliberate ways until resistance killed her. When Marcus told them what he'd found, Catherine traced the name on the page with trembling fingers. "She tried to protect us. Then we finish what she began," Sarah answered, but protection came too late for many. By July, sickness crept through the slave cabins, lesions, fever, weakness that rotted the body from within. Pritchett called it bad blood and recommended isolation. Marcus, reading the colonel's medical notes, recognized the truth. Syphilis, introduced through the very experiments the colonel had conducted. He brought the evidence to Sarah one sweltering evening, spreading the papers across her desk. "Your father infected them. Deliberately or by disease he carried himself. It's spreading." Catherine turned pale. "How many?" "At least 7 now, maybe more." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Then we treat them all." She summoned Dr. Grayfield from Hanville, who arrived complaining about wasted time on Negro ailments. He confirmed the diagnosis, prescribed mercury, and suggested isolation until death thinned the contagion. Sarah dismissed him and ordered Pritchett to prepare medicine, food, and rest quarters for every sick worker. "No one dies because of him," she said. It was the first command Marcus heard that sounded human. He obeyed, recording treatments and recoveries with the precision the colonel had once used for torment. And somewhere in that grim labor, sympathy began to take root, a dangerous tenderness for women who were at once victims and wardens. Meanwhile, the executors pressed for progress. Breenidge, puffed with self-importance, proposed his nephew Thomas as a husband for Sarah, a man of modest fortune and extravagant debts. Perfect for their plan. She accepted, insisting on a prenuptial contract that granted her sole control of Bell River's finances. The document turned Thomas into a figurehead before the wedding even occurred. Catherine's prospects dwindled. Varley turned his attention to a widow in Montgomery, and the executors rejected younger suitors. As the year waned, desperation sharpened her thoughts. "If I cannot find a husband," she told her sister one night, "then I will marry one already dying." Sarah looked up sharply. "You mean to marry for a funeral?" Catherine's voice was steady. "For survival." In early December she found him, Lawrence Kemper, a widower of 51, frail from consumption, grateful for any companionship. The executors approved without hesitation. Catherine returned from their meeting and told Marcus, "He'll be dead within a year. I'll be free before the ink on the will dries." Marcus stared at her. "You'll let him die knowing you could save him?" "I'll let nature finish what it started." Sarah's wedding took place in mid-December 1847, a spectacle of lace and hypocrisy. Guests filled the parlor with perfume and platitudes, while Sarah stood motionless beneath her veil, reciting vows that meant nothing. Marcus watched from the back, a shadow among servants, and wondered whether the colonel's ghost stood beside her smiling. That night, after the revelers staggered home and Thomas slept in his new room drunk on brandy and illusion, Sarah came to the study where Marcus waited. "It's done," she said. "The first condition met. The second begins now. Their encounters were mechanical, scheduled, stripped of emotion. She approached it like an equation, an act to produce evidence of fertility, nothing more. Yet in rare moments afterward, guilt cracked her composure. "My father did this to women for 20 years, she whispered once. I told myself I was different. "I'm not," Marcus said nothing. There was no absolution to give. By November's end, she was pregnant, and the plantation buzzed with approval. The executors congratulated Thomas for his virility. Thomas congratulated himself for his fortune. None saw the quiet revulsion in Sarah's eyes. Catherine's marriage followed weeks later, and by early 1848 the house held 2 husbands, 2 wives, and 1 secret father. Bell River had met the conditions of the will, but beneath its polished veneer something rotten pulsed, deceit layered over deceit. A legacy remade through sin, and as the winter deepened, the ghosts of Bell River began to stir. By January of 1848, Bell River Plantation shimmered with a veneer of order. The fields were trimmed and quiet beneath the winter frost. The ledgers balanced, the fires burning evenly in every hearth. To passing neighbors, it looked as though Colonel Sutton's legacy had passed smoothly into capable hands. The twin daughters who had once been whispered about for their reclusion were now wives, soon to be mothers, carrying on the name and the property their father had carved out of other people's lives. But inside the great house, the walls had begun to whisper again. It started with the smallest things, unexplained tremors in Sarah's hands, Catherine waking from sleep gasping for air, letters left half-written on their father's old desk. The air itself felt charged, as though Bell River were a creature holding its breath. Thomas Breenage, Sarah's husband, arrived on the plantation as if stepping into a fantasy he had long rehearsed. His debts in New Orleans had nearly destroyed him, and the marriage offered both wealth and respectability. He paraded through the halls like a man granted a new kingdom, oblivious to the fact that the Queen already ruled without him. His name appeared on the account books, but every figure, every decision, every letter of authority bore Sarah's hand. The marriage was legal, its power entirely illusion. Catherine's husband, Lawrence Kemper, came in the new year, coughing blood into his handkerchief as he disembarked from the carriage. He was a man already half dead, moving through the parlor like a ghost uncertain of his welcome. He thanked everyone excessively, his voice thin and polite. The sisters received him with gracious smiles that masked calculation. He was perfect, weak, isolated, eager to please. A man too grateful to question why his young wife slept in a separate room. Marcus watched all of it from the edges of the rooms, from the corners of hallways where servants disappeared into silence. His duties had expanded far beyond accounting. He oversaw treatments for the sick, maintained the new rations, managed correspondence, and mediated between the sisters when their tempers clashed. He had become indispensable and dangerously visible. The tension between Sarah and Catherine simmered in every conversation. Sarah, heavy with child, grew colder, more controlled, her words clipped and precise. Catherine became restless, impatient for her own pregnancy to begin, frustrated by the fragility of the dying man she'd chosen. Their unity, once seamless, began to fracture into suspicion. Where one saw strategy, the other saw betrayal. One night in late January, as frost coated the magnolia trees and the air smelled of coal smoke, Marcus heard their voices raised upstairs. He moved quietly toward the sound and paused outside Sarah's room. The words came through the door, sharp as knives. "You want to murder him?" Sarah's voice cut through, trembling with anger. "It isn't enough that he's dying. You want to hurry it. He'll live long enough to ruin everything," Catherine snapped back. "A few drops of arsenic in his tea and it's over. That's not survival, Catherine. That's damnation." Catherine's laugh was brittle. "And what do you think we've been doing since the night Father died?" A silence fell that seemed to stretch the length of the hallway. When Catherine spoke again, her tone was calm, too calm. "Don't look at me that way, sister. We both know you put the poison in his cup first." The words froze Marcus in place. A cold, metallic realization settled in his chest. The colonel's death had not been the mercy of a failing heart. It had been planned, measured, executed. Sarah's reply was low, hoarse with exhaustion. He was going to sell you. Sell Marcus. He wanted us married to men who would continue his experiments. I couldn't let that happen. So we killed him, Catherine said. And you pretend that makes us free. When Marcus stepped into the room, both women turned. Catherine's nose bled where Sarah had struck her. Sarah's cheek was marked with fresh scratches. They looked less like sisters than reflections of the same broken will, each cracked in a different way. You killed him, Marcus said quietly, not accusing, not yet, just naming the truth. Sarah sank onto the bed, her hands trembling. It was the only way. He chained you your whole life, Marcus replied, and you freed yourselves by chaining someone else, me. Catherine glared. Don't moralize. You agreed to our plan. I agreed to survive, Marcus said. There's a difference. They fell silent, each realizing how fragile their alliance had become. The sound of drunken laughter drifted up from the parlor, Thomas, celebrating his new life without realizing he was nothing but a pawn. The sound only deepened the stillness between them. Sarah was the first to speak again. If you poison Lawrence, they'll find out. The executors will investigate. We'll lose everything. Catherine's voice cracked. I can't keep living like this, waiting for him to die. Then wait, Sarah said. Endure. When it's done, when the estate is secure, then we decide who we want to be. Marcus saw something shift in Catherine's eyes then, a glint of despair hardening into resolve. She would wait, but not forever. The weddings, pregnancies, and deceit tied Bell River in a web so tight that even breath seemed measured. The servants moved quietly, whispering that both sisters were cursed. Pritchett kept his distance, unnerved by the subtle power that had replaced the colonel's brutality. Women shouldn't run a place like this, he muttered to Marcus once. It makes nature uneasy. Marcus said nothing, but he knew nature had nothing to do with what haunted Bell River. Sarah's pregnancy advanced quickly. Dr. Grayfield visited in spring to confirm her condition, congratulating Thomas with a smile that never reached his eyes. The doctor had learned not to question strange circumstances at Bell River. He had seen enough. Meanwhile, Catherine played her role to perfection. She nursed her husband through fevers, read scripture beside his bed, and spoke softly to the servants about the trials of caring for the sick. When they were alone, her expression emptied of tenderness. She counted his breaths, his coughs, the drops of blood on his pillow as though each one were a coin toward her release. Marcus tended to her quiet fury the way one might tend a flame, keeping it from consuming the whole house. By early March, the pattern of deceit had become routine. Sarah met Marcus in the study after the household slept. They spoke little. The acts that bound them had already become mechanical. Yet beneath the silence, something more dangerous began to grow, an awareness of how each used the other, and of the strange intimacy that such use created. They had become mirrors of each other's captivity. One night, Sarah lay on the study floor afterward, staring at the ceiling beams. My father thought he was God, she murmured. Now I understand what it feels like, to shape life and destroy it at the same time. Marcus turned away. God didn't own his creations, didn't he? She whispered. Then why are any of us still here? The child quickened soon after. The plantation rejoiced. The executors wrote letters of approval. Catherine, however, had grown gaunt and sleepless, her own pregnancy still a hope, her husband's cough worsening by the hour. She feared the will's deadline as much as she feared childbirth itself. In May, salvation or damnation finally came. Catherine woke Marcus before dawn, her nightdress spattered with blood. It's happening, she said simply. He's dying. They stood together outside Lawrence Kemper's door and listened to the rattle of his lungs. At sunrise, the coughing stopped. Catherine entered, touched his wrist, and nodded. It's finished. He was buried 3 days later beneath the oaks behind the house. The Reverend Yates read his lines about peace and eternity, and no one noticed the small, satisfied stillness in Catherine's face. She was now a widow, her freedom secured by a grave, but her relief did not last. Guilt crept in at night, curling beside her like a lover she could not escape. She began to dream of her father, of his grey face at the desk, his eyes opening as the poison took hold. Sometimes she woke to the sound of his pen scratching across paper that no longer existed. Sarah's child grew inside her as Catherine wasted away in guilt and waiting. The symmetry that had defined them since birth now fractured completely. Where Sarah hardened, Catherine hollowed, and Marcus stood between them, watching as the plantation's order decayed into something closer to madness. In June, the executors visited for their inspection. Greenidge arrived with an entourage of clerks, puffed with importance and bourbon. He examined Sarah's swollen belly, nodded approvingly, and announced that Bell River's future was secure. "You've done your father proud," he said. Marcus, listening from the doorway, thought of the breeding ledgers in the colonel's desk, and wondered if pride had always sounded that obscene. After the guests departed, Sarah dismissed the servants and stood before the parlor window, her hands folded over her stomach. The sunset stained the river red. "Do you ever think we've made something worse than he did?" she asked. Catherine's voice came softly from the shadows. "We've made life. That's all anyone ever does." "No," Sarah said. "He made control, and we've become its echo." Marcus could no longer tell whether she spoke to her sister, to him, or to the ghosts of Bell River. Every word in that house seemed to drift upward like smoke, joining the whispers that filled the rafters. The months crawled by. The heat returned, thick and merciless. Thomas drank himself senseless most nights, muttering about the plantation's unnatural quiet. Catherine began feeling faint, then feverish, the signs of pregnancy finally, perhaps mercifully, appearing. She greeted the nausea with a strange joy. "It means I've done it," she told Marcus, clutching her abdomen. "We've beaten him." But Marcus had stopped believing in victory. He'd begun copying his documentation again, this time in smaller handwriting, hiding the pages inside his mattress. The evidence of everything. The colonel's experiments, the syphilis outbreak, the poison, the scheme. Had to survive. He would find a way to send it north. Freedom now meant truth. In the oppressive stillness of late summer, the line between duty and conscience thinned until it nearly vanished. Sarah's temper flared without warning. Catherine drifted through the halls, murmuring to herself. Pritchett avoided them both. The enslaved kept to their cabins after dark, claiming to hear footsteps on the stairs when no one was there. Bell River had become a haunted body, its heartbeat slowing, its breath shallow. And somewhere within that suffocating calm, Marcus realized what he had truly inherited. Not freedom, not redemption, but a legacy poisoned long before any of them were born. By late September of 1848, the air above the Bell River hung so thick with heat that even the insects moved slowly. The earth itself seemed tired, cracked, and waiting. The cotton field stood pale and motionless, and the house was filled with the sour scent of boiled linens and tonic. Sarah's time had come. The servants whispered prayers in the kitchen, crossing themselves as thunder rolled across the horizon. The birth began before dawn, with Sarah's body stiff and unyielding, her voice breaking through the walls in long, strangled cries. Catherine waited outside the door, pacing the hallway, one hand pressed against her own swelling stomach. The two sisters had always mirrored one another, but now one stood at the threshold of creation while the other watched from the edge of dread. Dr. Grayfield arrived at sunrise, muttering that womenfolk should labor in silence. He ordered Marcus to fetch hot water and clean linens. Marcus obeyed without expression, though inside he was drowning in the sound of it. The cries, the hurried footsteps, the murmur of women coaxing life from pain. Hours passed. The doctor cursed softly as blood soaked through the sheets. The air thickened with the metallic scent of iron and sweat. Catherine pressed her ear to the door and heard her sister's voice, a low moan rising into a scream that did not sound human. Then silence, then a thin, wavering cry that broke it. The child had come. When Grayfield emerged, his face was grey. "Alive," he said, "by the grace of God, but she's weak. You'll keep her still for a month." Catherine brushed past him and entered. Sarah lay motionless, her hair plastered to her temples, her eyes half open. In her arms she cradled a newborn boy, his skin pale gold, his features unmistakably mixed. No one spoke it aloud, but every eye in the room saw what it meant. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. Their plan had succeeded and doomed them all. Catherine met his gaze, then looked away. "You should go," she whispered to him later when the house had gone still. "Leave before anyone else notices. I can hide this for a while." Sarah's voice, thin but certain, drifted from the bed. "No, he stays." Catherine turned, startled. "If they see, then let them." Sarah smiled faintly, her lips cracked and pale. "Our father wanted proof of his work. Let this be it." For the first time since she had known him, Marcus felt fear not for himself but for her. He understood then that she was no longer rebelling against her father. She was finishing his experiment, shaping it into something monstrous enough to end the bloodline forever. The boy was named Nathaniel, after the man whose ghost still ruled every corner of the estate. Sarah insisted on it with a steadiness that frightened everyone. She claimed it was to appease the executors, but the truth was darker. She wanted the name to be a curse upon itself, a circle that would never close. In the weeks that followed, Sarah barely left her room. The baby thrived, his tiny chest rising and falling in the rhythm of quiet storms. Thomas, oblivious, paraded his supposed heir through town. The neighbors congratulated him, never daring to mention what the child's skin revealed. No one in Loudoun County ever confronted the Sutton family directly. Power, they knew, carried its own truth. Yet gossip spread like rot beneath the floorboards. Catherine's pregnancy grew heavier, more difficult. She could no longer climb the stairs without trembling. Fever rose in her by night, and she began speaking to shadows that no one else could see. The servants whispered that she was being punished for her husband's death. "She walks with ghosts," one of them said. "Her child will be born with their eyes." Marcus visited her when he could. He brought broth, water, and silence. Sometimes she spoke his name softly as though testing its shape. Other times she asked questions he could not answer. "Do you think the dead can see what we do here? Do you think she loves him, the child? Do you think any of this will matter when we're gone?" Each time he remained quiet, and each time she seemed grateful for it. By October, Sarah had recovered enough to walk the grounds again. She wore black despite the heat and carried the child in her arms like an emblem of defiance. The overseer Pritchett avoided her entirely now, muttering that the blood's gone wrong in that family. The enslaved averted their eyes, unsure whether to fear or pity her. Marcus followed her across the fields one afternoon and found her standing at the edge of the old slave burial ground, the child pressed to her chest. "He doesn't cry here," she murmured. "He knows where he came from," Marcus said quietly. "And where is that, Sarah?" She looked back at him, and for a moment he saw not the woman but the child she once was, frightened, caged, and trying to understand her own reflection. "From us," she said. "All of us. The same river runs in every vein on this land." In early November, the house filled with the sounds of labor once more. Catherine's time had come, and this time there was no doctor. Greyfield had fled Hanville after rumors reached him of the Sutton child's complexion. It was Marcus who boiled the water, who steadied her shaking hands, who knelt beside the bed as the contractions tore through her body. The thunder rolled again that night, just as it had for her sister. Bell River had a way of remembering its own patterns. By dawn, Catherine lay pale and still, her breath barely stirring. A baby girl slept beside her, fragile as porcelain. Marcus cleaned the sheets and looked at the infant's face, at the deep brown of her eyes. He realized what Sarah had meant when she spoke of rivers. The blood had indeed circled back upon itself. The children of Bell River carried every secret that land had ever consumed. Sarah entered the room later, silent, holding her own child. For a long moment, the sisters simply looked at one another, the two infants between them like mirrors of fate. Then Sarah smiled faintly. "Now it's complete," she said. Catherine turned her face away. "It's over." Sarah shook her head. "Nothing's ever over here." Within weeks, the rumors grew impossible to ignore. Neighbors began sending polite letters of inquiry. The executors requested portraits of the newborn heirs. And one night, as the wind howled through the cracked shutters, someone hammered on the front door until the hinges rattled. It was Pritchett. His face was white with fear. "They know," he said. "Half the county's talking." They're saying the children ain't white. They're saying you—" Sarah's eyes narrowed. "We what?" Pritchett swallowed. "That you took a man from the quarters to your bed." Silence filled the hall. Marcus, standing behind her, felt the air thicken. Pritchett looked from one sister to the other, uncertain which was more dangerous. "They'll come," he whispered. "You know how they deal with things like this." Sarah dismissed him with a gesture. "Let them come." The following week, the county magistrate himself rode to Bell River with 2 deputies. He was an old friend of the colonel, a man who believed the world ran on order and appearance. He stood in the parlor with his hat in hand, his voice oiled with courtesy. "There's been talk," he said. "Ugly talk, the kind that stains good families if it ain't put to rest." Sarah smiled. "Then rest it," he hesitated. "If the child were to pass naturally, the matter might fade." Marcus, listening from the corridor, felt his stomach turn. The magistrate had offered the unspoken solution: a small grave, a silent mourning, a family restored to purity. Sarah's answer came so quietly that the men leaned forward to hear it. "If anyone touches my son," she said, "I'll burn this county to ash." The words carried the weight of prophecy. The magistrate left pale-faced, muttering about hysteria and divine punishment. But within days the rumors became torches. A mob gathered in Hanville, shouting that Bell River had bred with its own slaves, that the Sutton name was cursed. The same men who once dined at their table now called for purification through fire. Sarah ordered the servants to pack only what they could carry. "We leave at dawn," she told Marcus. "We'll go east. There's land in Georgia. We'll start again." Catherine refused. "I won't run," she said. "If they burn it, let them. This house was built on bones. It deserves to fall." Sarah's voice broke for the first time. "And the children?" Catherine looked down at her daughter. "The children belong to Bell River now. Whatever happens to it will happen to them." The storm came before dawn, not of thunder but of fire. The mob reached the gates carrying torches and rifles, shouting scripture. Marcus ran through the halls, gathering the infants, shouting for the sisters. Catherine had locked herself in her room, the child in her arms. Sarah stood at the top of the stairs, her son pressed against her chest, her face lit by the glow of approaching flames. "You can still escape," Marcus urged. "Take the children, take the carriage." Sarah looked at him with a strange calm. "This house is my confession," she whispered, "and confessions must burn." Outside, the torches hit the veranda. The wood caught with a roar. The windows blew outward in waves of heat. Sarah turned and vanished down the hallway toward her sister's room, the baby's cry rising like a prayer swallowed by smoke. Marcus fled through the back passage, carrying what he could: the ledgers, the journals, the evidence. He reached the riverbank as the flames devoured the roof. Behind him, the plantation that had fed on generations collapsed into itself, glowing red against the dawn. The screams faded into the crackle of fire, and then into silence. By morning, nothing remained of Bell River but ash and rumor. The mob scattered, satisfied that purity had been restored. They did not search for bodies. They did not find any. Weeks later, downriver in Mobile, a letter arrived at the office of a northern shipping merchant. It contained pages written in 3 different hands, one elegant, one trembling, one precise. The writer claimed to be a former slave of the Sutton estate, documenting 20 years of abuse and experiment. The envelope was signed with a single initial, M. The letter would vanish into archives for a century before anyone read it, but its closing line would outlive the plantation it described. The fire did not cleanse Bell River. It only revealed what had always been buried beneath its fields. The fire that consumed Bell River burned for 3 days. The flames fed on pine beams soaked in oil, on curtains spun from silk, on ledgers thick with the dust of 2 generations. When rain finally came, it fell black and bitter, coating the ruins like ink spilled from a divine hand, too weary to finish the sentence. The townspeople came at dawn to witness what remained. Only the brick chimneys stood like tombstones rising from a landscape of ash. The magnolia trees, once symbols of grace, were charred skeletons. The air smelled of salt and something sweetly rotten. In the smoldering wreckage they found no bodies, only warped silver spoons, bits of lace fused into glass. and the faint outline of two cradles melted into the floorboards of what had been the nursery. They said the twins had perished with their children, trapped by falling beams. Some claimed they'd seen them standing in the upper windows as the house burned, unmoving, like saints in a pyre. Others whispered they'd fled across the river into the cypress swamps, carrying their mixed blood heirs into the dark, where no white man dared follow. The truth sank beneath the same waters that had once reflected the mansion's facade. The county sheriff closed the investigation in a single line: fire of unknown origin. Inhabitants presumed dead, and with that, the name Sutton disappeared from the rolls. The land was auctioned to settle debts, divided into smaller farms. The new owners ploughed over the ashes, planting cotton that grew tall and white, as if the soil were trying to forget. But the river did not forget. 18 years later, in the spring of 1867, a team of federal surveyors arrived in Loudoun County to map the post-war territory. Reconstruction had changed everything and nothing. The plantation system was gone in name, yet the fields still belonged to the same few families. The ruins of Bell River had long been swallowed by vines, its name avoided in polite company. The surveyors camped by the water, unaware that their campfires burned atop a graveyard. One of them, a young cartographer named Samuel Green, noticed strange formations in the earth, low mounds arranged in deliberate symmetry. When he returned the next morning to measure them, he found fragments rising from the mud after a storm. A cracked porcelain doll, a silver locket, a page of writing preserved between layers of soot. The ink was faded, but 3 initials were still legible in the corner. SCS. Curiosity drew Green to dig further. Beneath the topsoil, he uncovered charred floorboards, and beneath them, the remnants of a cellar wall. He followed it to a small chamber half filled with stagnant water. Inside were 3 iron rings bolted into stone, their chains still attached. Nearby lay a rusted lockbox, its lid warped but intact. Inside were papers, dozens of them written in multiple hands. Some pages were neat and methodical, others frantic, blurred by smoke and time. The first line he could make out read, "If anyone finds this, know that the blood of Bell River was mixed long before the fire." Green took the documents north, believing them to be plantation records. He presented them to his superior, who passed them to a reconstruction office in Montgomery. There they languished among stacks of confiscated ledgers, forgotten until a historian from Massachusetts stumbled upon them in 1902. By then, the story of Bell River had turned to myth, a southern ghost tale told in parlors when the lamps burned low. The historian, Dr. Althea Whitcomb, spent years deciphering the documents. She discovered the colonel's journals, detailed with the cold precision of a scientist cataloging livestock. She found letters written by Marcus, recording not just the experiments but the daily cruelties of life under the colonel's rule. And she found pages written in a woman's hand, thin, elegant, unsteady. Sarah's words, though singed and incomplete, told of defiance disguised as obedience, of 2 sisters carrying their father's sins to term and calling it justice. The letters ended abruptly in the autumn of 1848. The final entry, unsigned, was written in the same steady hand that had described births and deaths alike. "The river runs red tonight. If it takes us, let it remember." Dr. Whitcomb published her findings in a small academic journal that few read. Most dismissed it as melodrama, another Reconstruction morality tale. But a handful of abolitionist descendants recognized the name Marcus. Among their archives in Philadelphia, they discovered matching handwriting in an anonymous manuscript catalogued decades earlier. The same man, older, freer, and still haunted. The second manuscript filled the missing years. Marcus had escaped the fire, carrying the evidence across the South disguised as a freedman preacher. He reached Mobile, then Charleston, then finally Boston, where he dictated his memories to a sympathetic printer. His account ended with a single revelation. The twins lived. I saw them cross the river before dawn. One carried a boy, the other a girl. They did not look back. After that, Marcus vanished from the record. Some said he returned to Alabama under another name, working to free those still bound in debt peonage. Others claimed he drowned in the same river that had spared him once. His manuscript survived, copied by hands that understood its weight, hidden until the century turned. In 1919, a flood swept through Lown County, washing away the topsoil from the old Bell River site. When the waters receded, children from a nearby tenant farm found bones tangled in the roots of cypress trees, 2 adult skeletons, a man's and a woman's, lying side by side. The man's arm was curved around the woman's shoulders, and between them were the smaller remains of 2 infants. The coroner wrote, circa 19th century, and buried them again, marking the grave only with a wooden cross. But the local people knew whose bones they were. They stopped drawing water from the river after that. Livestock refused to drink there. At night, travelers said they heard babies crying across the floodplain, or saw 2 women standing in the shallows, holding bundles close to their chests. By the 1930s, the legend had settled into the soil as firmly as the cotton that grew upon it. They said the Sutton sisters appeared whenever the river rose too high, warning those who tried to build on their land. They said the water turned black each spring because it remembered what had been done to it. And they said that if you stood on the old ferry road at dusk, you could still see the ruins beneath the surface, columns and chimneys glowing faintly as if lit from below. Decades passed. Wars came and went. Highways were laid across old plantations. The Bell River Tract became federal land, its boundaries erased from maps. But the story refused burial. Every generation found it again, in sermons and whispers. In the uneasy way the locals avoided that stretch of the river. In 1963, a group of students from Birmingham came searching for evidence of slavery sites to document for a civil rights archive. They camped near the ruins, unaware of the history they were walking upon. That night, one of them, a young woman named Delilah Price, woke to the sound of a baby crying. When she stepped outside, the mist over the river parted. 2 figures stood in the shallows, pale and still, their dresses rippling though there was no wind. Each held a child swaddled in dark cloth. The moonlight caught the reflection of their faces, mirror images, eyes hollow and endless. Delilah ran screaming into the woods. By morning, the camp was deserted. Only her recorder remained, half melted from water though there had been no rain. The tape inside was damaged, but one fragment survived. A woman's voice whispering, low and rhythmic, like a lullaby twisted into lament. Scholars who studied it decades later couldn't agree on the words, but one syllable repeated again and again. River. River, river. In 1999, long after the river had shifted course, archaeologists reopened the site with ground-penetrating radar. Beneath 15 feet of sediment they found the remains of the old foundation, and under that, the cellar wall where Marcus once uncovered his chains. They found fragments of bottles labeled mercury, human teeth filed smooth, a rusted scalpel, and the warped remnants of a lockbox identical to the one recovered in 1867. Inside were 2 silver lockets. One bore the initials SS, the other CS. Each contained a miniature portrait painted in ivory. The same face in both, identical down to the last stroke. One smiling faintly, one solemn. The inscription beneath was almost gone, but when cleaned under magnification, it revealed a single line written in Latin. Quod sanguis miscet, ignis purgat. What blood joins, fire purifies. The lockets were placed in a museum in Montgomery behind glass, labeled simply recovered from the Bell River Plantation, circa 1840-1849. Visitors rarely lingered before the display. Something in the reflection of the glass unsettled them, the faint suggestion of another face beside their own, watching from the dark. And still the river moved on, silent, slow, indifferent. Yet every few years, when the water level dropped after a drought, locals swore they saw glints beneath the surface, bits of glass, iron rings, and sometimes the curve of a cradle half buried in silt. The current would take it back soon enough. The Bell River always buried its memories before morning. In the end, the story returned to where it began. A courthouse fire, records destroyed, names erased. But the truth had never lived in ink. It had lived in the bloodlines of those who carried it unknowingly, the children of the women who burned. Even now, some families in that county carry gray eyes that do not match their skin, or dreams of a house on fire beside a river that no one can find on a map. They wake with the taste of smoke and the echo of lullabies they never learned. And though they tell themselves it's only imagination, they never linger near water after dark, because the river remembers. It remembers the chains and the cries, the births and the fire. It remembers 2 women who tried to burn their inheritance out of existence. And it remembers the man who carried their truth into the world, only to vanish into its depths. Some nights when the moon is low and the mist hangs heavy, the river still whispers their names, not as condemnation, but as warning: Sarah, Catherine, Marcus. The current carries the syllables like prayer beads, turning endlessly, never fading. For in the heart of the South, history never truly dies. It only changes shape, waiting to be found again when the water rises.